Hi guys, back with another video for you today. I think I'm a little done with challenging fragrances for 2 days in a row. So today I'm going to answer a question that I had received. And I'm putting together another Your Fragrance Questions Answered video. I know I'm a little behind. That will be done next week. But I thought since this particular topic would make a video, like a better video on its own, I thought I'd cover it as a separate video because it'll be a longer video. But today I'm talking about what fragrance DNA is. Now I've mentioned fragrance DNA or DNA of different perfumes, and I'm going to cover it all and let you know some houses that I find DNA running throughout the different fragrances. So if you want to find out about fragrance DNA and which fragrances or which houses or which perfumers have a DNA in their fragrances, then please stay tuned. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Sebastian with Smelling Great Fragrance Reviews. Yes, today I'm talking about fragrance DNA. There are several houses that I know of that have a DNA in their fragrances, and some actually admit that they have a DNA. Some you can kind of tell. For me, I find that fragrance houses that have one perfumer, for example, the biggest one for me is Tower Perfumes. Andy Tower, his fragrances, there was the DNA running throughout his fragrances. He's the only perfumer for the house. The house is named after him. There's a major DNA running throughout the fragrances. Another one is Francesca Bianchi. It's a single perfumer. She does all her perfumes, and I can smell the DNA. So this is something that is definitely common in perfumery, and I'm going to discuss it with you today, letting you know different houses, different perfumers, and different fragrances today. But before I do, if this is your first time tuning into the channel and you still haven't subscribed to the channel, please do click the subscribe button below and also click the bell so that you'll be notified for future videos and giveaways. So first, let me go ahead and read to you what this question was that was sent to me. I'm going to try and read this without my glasses on. Hi Sebastian, I was wondering if you could do a video on fragrance DNA. I mean, I do think I have a good understanding of what it means, but would like to hear your thoughts on the subject. Just some random thoughts about what I think about the concept. When I smell a PDM, Creed, or Guerlain, I'm like, yeah, I can just tell it comes from this house. Is that their DNA? Is it that they source all their ingredients from one supplier? Like the vanilla is PDM, is unmistakably PDM vanilla, and the ambergris in Creed is unmistakably Creed. And just within the house of Guerlain, I know they use Guerlinade. What is that? What notes is it comprised of? And staying within the house, smelling anything from the L'Homme Ideal line is immediately recognizable to that line. So to Thierry Wasser for creating that DNA and being able to tweak it enough to produce flankers, retain that DNA, but are different enough not to be redundant purchases. Another aspect of DNA I'm curious about is blue fragrance DNA. What exactly does that mean? I have heard people refer to Elysium as a blue fragrance, but to me it doesn't fit that DNA at all. I know this is a long-winded email, but I want it to be as clear as possible about what I'm asking. Hope this makes the channel. Let me know if you have any questions. Appreciate it, Robert. So yes, it is a long question. And first of all, let me cover the topic of blue fragrances. I think blue fragrances not necessarily meaning to a DNA. I think it's necessarily meaning or referring to a style of perfumery, and there's a ton of them out there. Bleu de Chanel, Sauvage from Dior, not the original Eau Sauvage, but Sauvage from Dior. There's Burberry, Mr. Burberry line. Of course, you know, other blue fragrances fall under there. Elysium does fall because it is, after all, an aromatic, spicy styling of fragrance that kind of goes into the blue direction. Personally, I think blue fragrances have an aquatic thing running throughout it. Not necessarily overly marine or anything like that, but just kind of like a watery thing running throughout it. That's my interpretation of blue fragrances, and I can definitely categorize Elysium under that particular category of fragrances. So that answers that blue question, or blue fragrances question. But let's get to some of the, the DNA of some fragrances. As I mentioned, I first heard about Tower Odd, the Tower Perfumes DNA, early on in my career here with, getting involved with doing perfume reviews and collecting fragrances and things like that. So the Tower Oud, like the Guerlinade, is the Tower Perfumes DNA. For me, Tower Perfumes smell like there's something running throughout each fragrance. For example, a Cour de Desert is definitely a flanker of L'air du Desert Marocain. But for me, I feel like whatever is in the base of L'air du Desert Marocain, and typically that's what DNA for me refers to, whatever base they use in the fragrance composition is there. Then they add like top notes and heart notes to make it a little different. That's kind of my own interpretation of what a DNA is. It's pre-made. It's been proven to succeed with some fragrances. Like for example, as I mentioned, L'air du Desert Marocain. The DNA is pretty much that fragrance, I think, because it sells a lot. I mean, I think that's his most popular fragrance. So it's a given that he might use whatever is in the base of that fragrance as the DNA of every other fragrance he has. Because when I smell L'Air des Alpes Suisse, this one right here, I can totally pick up, you know, traces of the fragrance L'air du Desert Marocain, because I think he uses the base and he adds it to, you know, in the base here, and then I don't know how perfumers work, and I haven't taken too many classes. Perhaps he works from the base up and he adds notes up top and heart to see it works, and I think that's how the Tower Perfumes DNA happens. This is just my theories or my thoughts. I'm not 100% sure this is how it works, but that's how I'm experiencing some of the fragrances. Like a lot of the fragrances from Tower Perfumes, I get something that's L'air du Desert Marocainish running throughout it. Even, you know, like Incense Extreme or Incense Rosé is similar. The new Cologne de Maghreb, even, like it's inspired by Maghreb in Morocco. So there is something fresh, but definitely L'air du Desert Marocain like running throughout this particular fragrance as well. So I think when a perfumer for a house does create this base, they definitely do use it one from another, because in the end, for me, I look at Francesca Bianchi's fragrances and I look up the notes, and I do see a lot of similar notes running from one to the other. Leathers and orris come up quite a bit. Perhaps Francesca Bianchi loves those notes and she's created a base and then she uses it from one to the other. That's just my theory, but when I look up the notes for her fragrances, I do see that come up. So, and the fragrances do smell from one to the other. For example, Under My Skin reminds me of kind of like a naughtier version of The Dark Side. I mean, it's just taking that DNA or the base notes that she's created. Again, this is just my theory and how I'm interpreting these fragrances, but she takes it and then she, you know, amplifies some of the notes in the base, you know, adds additional notes, and I think that's how the fragrances are born. So this is a good way for you to experience the DNA, to smell fragrances from one to the other. And when you're kind of smelling them over and over again, you start smelling fragrances that smell similar. I mean, it's very, very obvious with Tower Perfumes, and it's also very, very obvious with Francesca Bianchi perfumes. I smell similarities, even with something like Sticky Fingers. I do pick up similar notes, and I think that orris and leather note is prominent here as well. Not as much, it's toned down a bit because this one, again, is about patchouli, but for me, this one, patchouli is up top and heart. It kind of settles down to that similar DNA for Francesca Bianchi perfumes. So that is something that I've thought of how it happens, and I've not spoken to these perfumers. I don't know that it is 100% like this, but this is what I'm experiencing, and it makes sense that it could be like this. Another brand that I want to talk about is Imaginary Authors. Now, one more brand with a perfumer, Josh Meyer, who creates all of his perfumes, all of them. There's no other perfumers involved, so then he's going to use a DNA or some kind of a base for his perfumes and build on it. And in the end, when the fragrance dries down, for example, you're smelling these two fragrances, which are completely different. Sundrunk is all oranges, City on Fire is all smoke. But for me, a lot of the fragrances remind me of Memoirs of a Trespasser for some reason. Once it dries down, you can see that kind of woody, resinous, vanillic kind of experience is there in the base, but up top and in the heart, you're, experiencing what the fragrance is about. Sundrunk is about oranges. A City on Fire is about fire, smoke. So you're experiencing that, but you're settling down to something kind of woody, resinous, and things like that. So that's definitely another house. If you want to smell and identify fragrance house's DNA, you can definitely smell the fragrances from Imaginary Authors, Francesca Bianchi, Tower Perfumes, and I think once again a good idea is to find a house that it's one perfumer, only one perfumer. You get to learn their technique and experience the DNA. So I'm going to move forward to a more well-known house. I'm going to go with something like Jacques Cavalier for Louis Vuitton. So when they first launched the first collection of 7 fragrances from Louis Vuitton, they were all for women. I wore them. They were fine. There were some a little masculine, some a little feminine. I have favorites in that lineup. Apogée, Contre Moi. Several of them, were good. But there was a DNA running throughout the whole collection. And the DNA for me was more of a watery thing. They do have that similarity. It's all running throughout it, and you get to recognize it, and it's like, okay, this is what he's using. He's using some kind of like a watery musk that runs throughout the entire collection, and there's a recognizability about it, and then also a cohesive quality about the fragrances so that it doesn't stand out, be like, okay, you've got all these great fragrances that are kind of similar but smelling different, and then there's that one odd man out that doesn't really connect with the collection. I think Jacques Cavalier's fragrances for Louis Vuitton do definitely have a DNA running throughout it. Even some of the men's fragrances, I don't find it as much in the men's line as I do with the women's line, but there is definitely a DNA there, and you can start recognizing. Same thing with François Demachet for Dior. Now, sometimes I can't recognize DNA with certain brands, but with François Demachet's fragrances, I can. But not as much as Jacques Cavalier, because sometimes I feel like fragrances were not created by François Demachet. Originally, the very original lineup from the Privé line, the Maison Christian Dior collection, they were all done by different perfumers. Annick Menardo did one, Francis Kurkdjian did one, and there were a few others, I believe. But they were all redone by François Demachet when he became the in-house perfumer. Now, one big brand that I know has a major DNA is Chanel. Chanel, I could recognize the Chanel DNA from a mile away. And the Chanel perfumers have been in the same family. It used to be Jacques Polge. Now it's Olivier Polge, father to son. And the fragrances are so recognizable. For me, the Chanel DNA seems to be aldehydes. I don't know why, but there is this aldehydic touch running throughout it. It kind of familiarized that smell, and you can kind of tell it's there. Even something like Sycamore, which is a very, very masculine fragrance, under there you can kind of smell the Chanel DNA, which is this kind of aldehydic, fizzy kind of an experience, which kind of sort of reminds me of Chanel No. 5, and then it doesn't, because Chanel No. 5 in the end is aldehydes. So that's another brand that has a major DNA. Now, the only thing that he was asking about was Guerlinade. I'm not the biggest expert with Guerlain and their older fragrances. I know that the L'Homme Ideal collection are flankers, so I guess there would be a DNA. I think that's what flankers are. We have to talk about flankers because in the end, a flanker is one original fragrance, and then they take that fragrance and create multiple flankers from it, and they add certain things to it. So that particular collection has a DNA, and it's the flankers DNA. I'm not sure it fits with the rest of Guerlain collection. I wouldn't be able to tell you, but there is the whole Guerlinade thing, and yes, they did have a DNA back then with their fragrances. So we can dive into the whole flanker, topic And of course, we go to Mugler for something like Pure Malt, with an offspring of something like Amen, or we can go to something like Angel, which was the original fragrance, and all of its flankers. Like, they've got a ton of flankers. For me, mostly DNA is one perfumer working and creating fragrances over and over and over again, and they have a certain DNA. With Mugler's fragrances, it was multiple perfumers working on them, and they were going from different houses that the perfumers came from, and they would use different notes from these houses, for example, like IFF, Givaudan, Firmenich, and things like that. So if they do that, yes, the notes are going to smell different, because that was one of the questions that was brought up in this topic. If you're using vanilla from the resource like Firmenich compared to Givaudan, it might smell different. Same with patchouli. So in that case, I don't think that there is a DNA unless they use the patchouli with something that they already have created. That is something I'm not 100% certain about. For me, most of the time, I can spot DNA when it's always the same perfumer. A couple more houses I should talk about. Definitely Maison Francis Kurkdjian. You can actually recognize his fragrances and his style, especially when it gets to his musky citruses. Definitely there. And also his ouds collection also had very similarities as well. So there's a recognizability thing with his fragrances. But one other brand, Jeroboam, I think is a great brand for you guys to check out if you want to learn a DNA, because for me, they have their original fragrance called Origino, which is the kind of the musk or the base of the fragrance on its own. You can buy that. And then it appears in their entire collection. According to the brand, this is what I've heard, that Origino is the originator, and then it goes into all of their fragrances. So you can smell that Origino fragrance as the base of all of their fragrance. That's kind of a DNA thing for me. It's pre-made, it sells on its own, and it's also the base of all their fragrances. So that's another fragrance house I think that's definitely worth checking out to learn a certain house's DNA. Now, a couple more brands like Papillon Perfumery, I think, also has a DNA, not as distinct as some of the other brands I mentioned, but definitely single perfumer. It's the perfumer Liz Moores. She works for her brand, and she creates all her fragrances, so you can kind of recognize her DNA. I find it more in not something like Tobacco Rose, but like from Anubis to Salome and things like that. You can kind of spot the base kind of has similarities. So the stronger fragrances, I can totally spot the DNA running throughout it. And another brand is Bogue Profumo. Bogue has a DNA. I think, once again, it's the same perfumer. And for me, Bogue Profumo has done a fragrance for Zoologist Perfumes called Tyrannosaurus Rex. I can totally recognize his style. Now that's a great example for you to try. If you know of a perfumer that does fragrances for their own house, and they've done a fragrance for a house like Zoologist Perfumes, smell the fragrance they've done for Zoologist Perfumes, then go smell the fragrances for his own house, and you can kind of totally see the similarities. Because I can totally see what he did for, like Bogue Profumo did for Zoologist Perfumes, reminds me of the fragrances that he's done for his own house. So he does have a certain DNA for sure. One other thing I want to bring up, the fragrances of Marc-Antoine Barrois created by Quentin Biche, B683, Ganymede. And then you also have the B683 X-ray version here, which to me is a combination of these two fragrances. He's created these two fragrances. Now, I'm going to go a step further as well. There's a fragrance house called Essential Parfums, and it's Bois Imperial. This also reminds me of those fragrances I mentioned. So he has a certain DNA that he's using for both of these houses. Now this house only uses one perfumer over and over, one perfumer for each fragrance. So I'm not sure if he'll come back and do another fragrance for this house, because every single fragrance has been a different perfumer. But when I smelled Bois Imperial, it quickly reminded me of Ganymede and also B683. So he's taken that DNA for Marc-Antoine Barrois, and he's created something here for this particular line. So that is another topic where perfumers do fragrances for one house and go to another house and do another similar fragrance, which kind of, for me, I kind of don't like that, because I feel like it's a little bit like cheating. But that's, again, it's a completely different topic, which I'm circling back to Jacques Cavalier now with the DNA for Louis Vuitton's fragrances. And then Jacques Cavalier has done the La Gemme collection, which also has similarities to the Louis Vuitton collection, but the men's collection. So there's all this stuff happening with DNA, and then also flankers, and then perfumers going from one house to another, creating similar fragrances. But I think, like I said, once you get to explore a certain house, like Tower Odd is definitely one I think you guys should all check out. Go check out and smell the fragrances of Tower Perfumes. I think once you start smelling them over and over again, you will definitely recognize the DNA, and it definitely runs from one perfume to another to another. And for me, I think L'air du Desert Marocain is the base fragrance that a lot of his other fragrances are based on. He doesn't necessarily use all the notes from that fragrance, but I think this is, again, my speculation. I'm not 100% sure. I haven't spoken about this topic with any of the perfumers, but I think that's kind of what's going on. They take a fragrance that's successful, has a great DNA, people love it, and then it's kind of translated over to other fragrances. And then the top notes and the heart notes are kind of, you know, new notes, and then in the base, it'll really remind me of another fragrance from the house. So that's what I think DNA is. A couple of more things. The question of Parfums de Marly was brought up, and also Creed was brought up. I do see some similarities with Parfums de Marly, and I think I don't see them with all their fragrances. Like for me, Carlisle and Layton do have like a DNA thing happening, but then there's Herod, which completely doesn't remind me of any of the other fragrances. So is there really a DNA? There could be, but I don't get it as much with Parfums de Marly. And Creed, on the other hand, I think definitely there is a DNA. I think they definitely use a DNA because it's all in the family, and it's all the perfumers, the Creed, father and son. So most likely they're using a similar kind of DNA running throughout their fragrances. But I'm not the expert on Creed. I like Creed. I don't love Creed. I have my favorites, and I haven't really studied those fragrances, but I can definitely see that there could be a DNA running throughout a lot of Creed fragrances, because again, it's in the family, it's individuals, father and son who do the perfumes. At least that's what I hear. They could also farm it out. I don't think they would do that, but I think there definitely is a DNA. But going back to the Parfums de Marly theory, I don't know. Parfums de Marly's Delina has 3 different flankers, is created by the same perfumer who did Ganymede and Marc-Antoine Barrois' B683 fragrances, and Bois Imperial. They don't remind me of one another, but the flankers for Delina do remind me of one another. So there we go with the flanker topic again. But for me, I think Parfums de Marly is not necessarily very DNA recognizable. A brand that I think definitely is Xerjoff, because they do tend to use a lot of similar the same perfumer over and over again. Chris Maurice, I think, is his name. So anyway, those are my thoughts on DNA. hope you guys understand this. I think, as I said, the best way for you guys to understand is if you don't have access to the big brand, I mean the small brands I was talking about, Chanel is definitely one house that you can try to kind of start learning their DNA, that smell. I get that aldehydic smell with the Chanel, but if you can access some of the smaller brands like Tower, Francesca Bianchi, Imaginary Authors, even Jeroboam, smell Jeroboam's original fragrance, Origino, and then smell, work your way throughout the other fragrances and see if you can spot them, how similar they are, because definitely their base DNA is Origino, and then the rest of the fragrances are built on that. It's kind of the musk is what they say, that Origino is the musk for the entire collection. Anyway, that's all I have for you today on fragrance DNA. I hope it makes sense. If you have any further questions or comments, please list below, or you can also send an email to lfsgquestions@gmail.com. Stay tuned next week for your fragrance questions answered video. I'm a little behind on that, but definitely coming. I've planned it all out. I've got my 12 questions I've selected, and I'm putting a video together for you soon. Other than that, guys, stay tuned tomorrow for a top 20. I've got a good one for you tomorrow. If you have any questions or comments, as I said, please list below. Please like this video. Please share it. Follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I'll be back with more videos very soon. Have a good one. Goodbye.